Grace had never expected her job at Meadowbrook Diner to become such a moral battlefield. When she first joined the team nearly 3 years ago, she was just a quiet, determined young woman looking to make ends meet. She worked the morning shift, stayed late when others called out, and picked up doubles to cover bills and help her younger brother, who was still in college. The hours were long, the tips inconsistent, and management never seemed to care much about the staff's well-being. Still, Grace stayed. She believed in doing things the right way, even when no one was watching. To her, kindness wasn't a tactic or a weakness, it was a responsibility. Over time, she started noticing things that didn't sit right. There was a pattern to how some of her co-workers treated people, an invisible line drawn between those who deserved good service and those who didn't. Customers in suits got extra smiles, faster service, and the good tables. But if someone walked in with paint on their boots or looked like they were counting change for coffee, it was like a switch flipped. Melissa, a senior server with seniority and a sharp tongue, would barely acknowledge them. Dylan, who had only been there a few months, conveniently avoided tables he thought wouldn't tip. While Grace watched it all in silence, unsure of when things had started to feel so wrong, she told herself not to get involved, that if she just kept her head down, focused on her own work, she could avoid the politics. But it wasn't that easy. Every time she witnessed a customer being ignored, rushed, or subtly insulted, a knot formed in her stomach. There was one morning she remembered vividly. A woman in scrubs had come in after a night shift. Clearly exhausted, Melissa rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about cheap tippers before walking past her like she wasn't even there. Grace ended up serving the woman herself. It didn't seem like a big moment at the time, but it stuck with her, like a tiny crack forming in the walls of the diner's culture. Grace wasn't confrontational by nature. In fact, she avoided conflict whenever she could. She was the type who apologized when someone bumped into her, but inside she was growing tired of pretending not to see. She began to notice other things too. The way management, especially Rick, the floor manager, turned a blind eye to favoritism. If a complaint came in about Melissa or Dylan, it got brushed aside. But if Grace made even a small mistake, like forgetting to clock out, Rick would call her in for a reminder chat. It was clear who had power in the diner, and it wasn't the ones trying to do the right thing. Still, Grace chose to lead by example. She greeted every customer the same, whether they looked like they drove a sports car or took the city bus. She smiled, she listened, and she never judged. Over time, a few of the regulars began requesting her by name. She didn't think much of it, just that maybe they appreciated her service. But the truth was, people notice when you treat them like they matter. Even in a place as ordinary as Meadowbrook, Diner Grace stood out. Unfortunately, standing out wasn't always a good thing when the culture rewarded the opposite. Behind the jokes and the gossip, there was an unspoken code among the staff: don't question the way things are, and for the most part, Grace didn't. Until the night that would change everything. The night a man walked in and was met with silence from everyone except her. She had no idea who he really was or what his presence meant. All she saw was a human being who deserved the same courtesy she offered everyone else. What she didn't know was that in choosing kindness over compliance, she had just lit the first match. And in a place as dry and brittle as Meadowbrook Diner, it wouldn't take long for everything to catch fire. It was a slow Wednesday evening at Meadowbrook Diner, the kind of shift where the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than the handful of conversations scattered across the room. The dinner rush had come and gone, and the remaining staff looked like they were counting the minutes until closing. Grace was behind the counter quietly restocking sugar dispensers, while Melissa lounged near the soda machine. Scrolling through her phone, Dylan leaned against a booth, trading lazy jokes with the line cook through the pass window. The air inside the diner had grown stale with routine. That was when the bell above the door jingled softly, signaling a new arrival. Grace looked up out of habit, expecting another local regular or a late-night coffee drinker, but instead she saw a man who didn't quite fit either mold. He was older, maybe in his early 60s, with silver hair neatly parted and kind eyes that scanned the room slowly, as if taking it all in. He wore a simple button-down shirt, tucked into slacks that had seen better days. His leather shoes were worn but polished, and his posture carried an odd mix of humility and confidence. He paused at the entrance for just a moment too long, as if expecting to be turned away. Grace noticed the way his fingers fidgeted slightly at his side, the way his gaze lingered on the staff who didn't even look up. Melissa didn't move. Dylan glanced in his direction, rolled his eyes, and returned to chatting. The diner, which had once claimed to serve everyone like family, had grown indifferent, and that indifference hit the man like a cold front. Grace didn't think twice. She wiped her hands on her apron, stepped out from behind the counter, and approached him with a gentle smile. "Evening, sir," she said. "Would you like a booth or a table?" He blinked, almost surprised by the attention. "Booth, please," he replied, his voice soft but clear. She led him to a clean seat near the window, handed him a menu, and poured him a glass of water without waiting to be asked. As she turned to walk away, he stopped her with a quiet, "Thank you." There was something in the way he said it, an earnestness, a weight that made Grace glance back. She nodded with a warm smile. To her it was simple. This was just another customer, but to him it meant far more. Throughout the meal, Grace checked in on him, like she would anyone else. She made small talk, kept his coffee topped up, and made sure his food came out hot. When his toast came out slightly burnt, she replaced it without being asked. When the jukebox started skipping and made the dining room awkwardly quiet, she cracked a small joke that made him chuckle. To her, this was just what good service looked like. But something about the way the man observed everything from the staff's body language to the way other customers were treated hinted that he wasn't just there for a meal. He was watching, absorbing, and storing every detail with quiet precision. Grace didn't realize she was at the center of a test that no one else even knew was happening. What Grace didn't know, and what no one at Meadowbrook Diner could have guessed, was that the man sitting at that booth was none other than Charles Walker, the owner and founder of the diner itself. He had built the place from nothing. Decades ago, poured his heart into it, and then stepped away from daily operations when it expanded. He had trusted others to carry his vision forward. But recently, the flood of complaints, the alarming turnover, and the whispered rumors of mistreatment had drawn him back in. And rather than send memos or call meetings, he chose the path few leaders dared to walk. He showed up in disguise to see it with his own eyes. That night, Charles didn't just see poor service. He saw neglect, prejudice, and a culture that had strayed far from his original dream. And yet, amid that disappointment, Grace had stood out like a beacon. She hadn't just served him a meal, she had offered dignity in a place where it had grown scarce. She didn't know who he was. She had no reason to expect anything in return, but that was precisely what made her kindness powerful. Charles sat back in his booth long after he'd finished eating quietly, watching the way she treated the next customer and the one after that. He noticed how she picked up the slack for co-workers who didn't pull their weight, how she smiled even when no one was looking, and somewhere between the last sip of coffee and the signed check, a decision formed in his mind. Meadowbrook didn't just need a new manager, it needed new leadership, it needed Grace. He left that night without fanfare, offering nothing more than a warm smile and a final "thank you." Grace smiled back, thinking little of it, but Charles knew what came next. In a single evening, Grace had unwittingly proven what kind of leader she already was. She had reminded him of what his diner used to be and what it still could become. And though she had no idea who she had just served, she was about to find out that sometimes one quiet act of respect can change the entire direction of a life. The next morning, the air inside Meadowbrook Diner felt unusually tense. Grace could sense it the moment she walked through the doors. Melissa gave her a look sharp, calculated, then quickly returned to polishing silverware that didn't need polishing. Dylan barely nodded in her direction, muttering something under his breath that made one of the line cooks chuckle. Grace tucked her apron around her waist and began prepping her section like usual, but something was off. The diner was too quiet. Not in the peaceful way it sometimes was before a rush, but in the way tension fills a space before something breaks. She kept her head down until Rick appeared from the back office, his face unreadable. "Grace?" he said. "Can I see you for a moment?" She followed him down the narrow hallway to the cramped little office at the back of the diner, her heart pounding louder with every step. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Rick gestured toward the single folding chair. She didn't sit. He leaned against the desk, arms crossed, eyes fixed on a spot just over her shoulder. "I heard about last night," he began. Grace didn't say a word, waiting. "You served a man who, according to Melissa and Dylan, has been in here before, caused some issues." Grace furrowed her brow. "He didn't cause any problems. He ordered dinner. He was polite. He paid. That's all." Rick sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, I'm not saying you did anything wrong, but sometimes it's easier to follow the way we do things here." Grace felt the familiar twist in her stomach, the one she always got when she saw someone being mistreated and did nothing. But today, she didn't stay silent. "You mean ignore people who don't look like they tip well, or people who look like they don't belong?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "That's not what I said." "But that's what you meant," Grace replied, her voice calm but firm. "You're telling me I should have ignored a customer just because Melissa and Dylan don't like how he looks?" There was a long pause. "It's not about looks," Rick muttered. "It's about avoiding unnecessary issues." Grace shook her head. "Treating people with respect isn't an issue, Rick. It's the bare minimum." The silence that followed was heavy. Rick didn't respond. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably and looked at his desk. It was a non-answer, and Grace knew it. She had worked long enough at Meadowbrook to know when management wanted to avoid taking a stance, but she also knew that silence was a stance, and today she couldn't walk away without saying something. "If doing my job the right way is going to be a problem, then maybe we've got bigger issues than one dinner shift," she said, then turned to leave, but just as she reached for the door, it opened from the other side. Melissa stepped in, arms folded with a smug look on her face. "Problem?" she asked. Already knowing the answer, Grace didn't even blink. "Yes, the way we treat people is a problem." Melissa scoffed. "Give it a rest." "Grace, not everyone needs saving." Dylan appeared behind her arms, crossed a smirk, tugging at his lips. "You know you're not getting a medal for playing hero, right?" Grace looked from one to the other, suddenly realizing how deep the culture rot had gone. This wasn't just about one customer. It was about an entire system built on looking the other way, on letting the loudest voices, the most cynical people dictate what was normal. "It's not about being a hero," Grace said quietly. "It's about having a conscience." But they weren't listening. They never had. As she walked past them and out of the office, Grace felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not doubt, but a kind of calm defiance. Maybe this was the beginning of the end for her at Meadowbrook Diner. Maybe she'd just written her own exit story by daring to care, but she also knew something else. If standing up for what was right cost her a job, then maybe it wasn't a job worth having. What she didn't realize was that the man she'd served the night before, Charles Walker, had already made a decision of his own. Grace had passed a test no one else knew they were taking, and the fallout from that quiet act of kindness was only just beginning. The morning light felt unusually harsh as it filtered through the dusty front windows of Meadowbrook Diner. Grace walked in like she always did, on time, apron in hand, ready to work. But from the moment she stepped onto the tiled floor, she sensed something was different. The usual clatter of cutlery and banter between staff had been replaced by a stifling silence. Melissa glanced at her, then looked away, lips twitching like she was holding back a smirk. Dylan, polishing the same coffee mug for the third time, didn't bother hiding the grin on his face. Grace tried to shake off the unease creeping into her chest. She moved toward the back to clock in, but before she could, Rick's voice called from the hallway behind her. "Grace, can I see you in the office?" She followed him without a word, her stomach tightening with every step. The hallway felt longer than usual, the walls closing in slightly, as if the building itself knew what was coming. Inside the office, Rick didn't ask her to sit. He stood behind the desk with his arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. The silence lingered a moment too long before he finally spoke. "Grace, we've decided to let you go." The words dropped like a lead weight in the room. Grace blinked. What she asked not. Because she didn't hear him, but because her brain couldn't catch up to the moment Rick sighed like the conversation exhausted him before it had even begun. "It's not working out," he said flatly. "We're moving in a different direction." The absurdity of it made her want to laugh, but her voice came out level. "I've worked here for nearly 3 years. I've never missed a shift. Never been late. I cover for people who don't show up. I've trained new hires. What direction are you talking about?" Rick shifted uncomfortably and opened a file on the desk, though he clearly wasn't reading it. "This isn't personal," he mumbled. "We just think it's time." Grace understood then. This wasn't about her performance. It was about control, about punishing her for the one thing she refused to do, look the other way. "This is because I served that man the other night, isn't it?" she asked. Rick didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence spoke louder than words. Her throat tightened, but she refused to let herself cry. Not here. Not in front of him. Instead, she slowly untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the desk. "You know this isn't right," she said quietly. "You're firing me for doing the job you hired me to do." Rick didn't flinch. He had made his decision. Grace turned to leave, but paused at the door. "One day, someone's going to hold this place accountable. And when that day comes, I hope you remember this moment." She walked out without another word. The weight of betrayal pressed against her chest, but beneath it was something steadier pride. She hadn't backed down, and that mattered more than keeping a job built on silence. As she stepped into the dining area for what would be the last time, Melissa leaned against the counter, arms crossed and grinning like she'd just won a game. Guess speaking up didn't work out so well. "Huh," she said, not even trying to whisper. Dylan chuckled from behind the espresso machine, offering her a mock salute. Grace didn't respond. She didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She simply lifted her chin, walked past them without so much as a glance, and pushed through the front doors into the cold morning air. The wind bit at her cheeks, and for the first time in years, she had nowhere to be. No job, no backup plan, just a pair of empty hands and the heavy knowledge that doing the right thing still came at a cost. Sitting in her car, Grace gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Her mind spun through the consequences, rent bills, her brother's textbooks. She had always found a way to make it work, but this felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing if there was ground beneath. Her phone buzzed. She almost didn't answer. Not in the state she was in, but something made her glance at the screen. Unknown number. With a shaky breath, she picked up. "Hello!" A deep voice responded, calm but firm. "Grace, this is Charles Walker." She froze. "I'm the man you served at Meadowbrook 2 nights ago." Her breath caught in her throat, and in that moment she had no idea just how much everything was about to change. Grace sat motionless in the driver's seat of her car, staring blankly through the windshield as the early morning sunlight spilled across the dashboard. Her fingers were still curled tightly around the steering wheel, her body stiff with the weight of everything that had just happened. She had just walked out of Meadowbrook Diner, fired for showing basic human decency. There had been no warning, no chance to explain herself, no real justification at all. Only the cold finality in Rick's voice and the smirks on Melissa and Dylan's faces as they watched her leave like she was something they had successfully swept out with the trash. Her thoughts spiraled how she would afford rent, what she would tell her brother, whether she had just thrown away her future by standing up for something she believed in. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, the screen lighting up with a number she didn't recognize. For a moment she considered ignoring it. She wasn't in the mood for a scam call or a distant relative checking in at the worst possible time, but something intuition perhaps urged her to pick it up. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then slowly pressed accept and held the phone to her ear. "Hello," she said, her voice thin. There was a pause on the other end, and then a deep, measured voice responded. "Grace, this is Charles Walker." Her breath caught. She knew that name. Everyone who had worked at Meadowbrook long enough knew it. "I'm the man you served at the diner the other night," he continued, "and I've been trying to reach you since I heard what happened." For a long moment, Grace couldn't find words. Her mind raced, piecing it all together. The quiet confidence, the way he had observed everyone so closely, the simple clothes that disguised something more. "You're the owner?" she finally asked. "I am. Charles confirmed I built Meadowbrook from the ground up, and lately I've been worried about what it's become. That's why I visited in secret." Grace leaned back in her seat, still stunned. "And you saw—" "I saw everything," Charles said gently. "I saw how you treated me with dignity when no one else would. I saw how the others responded to my presence and how you stood apart from all of it." His voice dropped lower, more serious. "And then I heard what they did to you after I left." Grace's hands trembled. They said it wasn't personal. She whispered more to herself than to him, that it just wasn't working out. Charles was quiet for a moment. Then, with a calm resolve, he said, "They fired the one person who still represented the values I built that place on. That tells me everything I need to know." There was a pause, and Grace held her breath. "Which is why I'm calling," he continued. "Grace, I want you to come back not as a waitress, but as the new manager of Meadowbrook Diner." The words echoed in her ears, like a dream she was afraid to believe. "Me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Yes, you," Charles said firmly. "You've shown more integrity in 3 years than some people show in a lifetime. That's the kind of leadership I need." The weight of the moment pressed down on Grace's chest. It felt unreal. Less than an hour ago, she had been cast out for doing the right thing. Now she was being offered the opportunity to rebuild the very place that had rejected her. Her voice shook as she answered, "If I say yes, I want to do it my way. Full authority, no interference." She expected hesitation, maybe a long pause, but Charles simply replied, "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Grace closed her eyes, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The shame, the anger, the uncertainty. It all began to lift piece by piece. She wasn't just being given a job, she was being trusted to set a new standard, to fix what was broken. She glanced up at the diner's familiar silhouette in the rearview mirror. It looked the same from the outside, but inside everything was about to change. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Her voice was steadier, now grounded. "I'll take the job." There was a smile in Charles's voice when he responded, "Good. Come in tomorrow at 8. Let's get started." Grace nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "I'll be there." She hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment longer. Then she placed the device down, gently adjusted the rearview mirror, and smiled for the first time all morning. The same doors that had just shut her out would open again tomorrow, and this time she wouldn't be walking in as an employee. She would be walking in as a leader. Grace barely slept that night. Her mind raced with thoughts, scenarios, questions she couldn't quiet. She replayed every moment of her last shift, the look on Rick's face, the smug satisfaction in Melissa's voice, Dylan's mock salute, as if they were burned onto her memory. But this time the loop didn't end in helplessness. It ended with a new beginning. Charles Walker's offer still echoed in her head. "Come in tomorrow at 8. You'll be in charge." And he hadn't hesitated when she made her single request full authority. If she was going to return to Meadowbrook Diner, it wouldn't be to patch holes in a sinking ship, it would be to rebuild the entire thing from the ground up. The next morning, Grace stood outside the diner's entrance with her shoulders squared, her breath catching in the early chill. This was the same door she had walked out of the day before, holding back tears and trying to salvage her dignity. But today she wasn't walking in as a discarded employee. She was walking in as the new manager, the person now responsible for rewriting the culture of a place that had lost its way. She took one final breath, reached for the handle, and pushed the door open. The familiar scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon drifted through the air. Conversations buzzed softly in the booths, but amid the normalcy, There was a subtle tension, as if the walls themselves sensed a change was coming. At first, no one noticed her. She walked in slowly, her head held high, eyes scanning the room with quiet determination. Then Melissa turned from the soda fountain mid-pour and froze. Her eyes narrowed, her body stiffened. Dylan, joking with a busboy near the kitchen, caught sight of Grace and went silent, his expression morphing from confusion to disbelief. Grace didn't break eye contact. She walked with purpose to the counter, set her bag down gently, and stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Melissa broke it first. "What the hell are you doing here?" she snapped. Her voice was sharp, but her confidence wavered. Grace tilted her head and gave her a calm, unreadable smile. "You'll find out soon enough." Before Melissa could respond, the kitchen door swung open. Rick emerged with a clipboard in one hand and irritation already etched into his features. "Melissa, I need you to—" He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes landed on Grace. For a moment, the entire diner felt suspended in time. Rick's face went pale, his mouth opened slightly, and he blinked as if trying to convince himself that what he was seeing wasn't real. "Grace," he asked, his voice flat, "you don't work here anymore." Grace didn't answer. Before she could speak, another voice filled the space, calm and unmistakably firm. I believe I can clarify that heads turned as Charles Walker stepped through the entrance dressed in the same quiet, unassuming style as before. But this time he carried himself with the unmistakable air of authority. He walked up beside Grace and faced the room. "As of this morning," he said, "Meadowbrook Diner is under new management." The room went still. Rick's face flushed, his grip on the clipboard tightening. "What?" he stammered. Charles didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words silenced everyone. "Rick, your position is terminated, effective immediately." Melissa gasped. Dylan looked like he'd been slapped. Rick opened his mouth to protest, but Charles cut him off. "I've heard enough from you, Charles," then turned to the staff. "Some of you may be wondering what's going on. Let me explain. I came here 2 nights ago, not as your employer, but as a customer. What I experienced was unacceptable. The only person who treated me with respect and professionalism was Grace." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "She is now your manager." For a moment, no one moved. Melissa's jaw dropped, Dylan's shoulders tensed. The busboy looked like he might burst into applause. Grace turned to face them fully. "If that makes things awkward," she said with a smile, "I guess we'll all have to adjust." Melissa opened her mouth, then shut it. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and fury. "You can't be serious," she muttered. "Oh, I'm very serious," Charles replied. "If you can't respect this new leadership, you're free to leave." Dylan looked around, calculating, but said nothing. Rick stood, frozen, stunned into silence. Grace, for her part, said nothing more. She didn't gloat, she didn't scold. She simply walked behind the counter, picked up the manager's keys from where Charles had placed them, and clipped them to her belt. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just working at Meadowbrook. She was leading it, and she was ready to turn the page. Charles Walker stood at the center of Meadowbrook Diner, no longer a quiet observer in the corner booth, but a man reclaiming his legacy. The air was heavy with stunned silence, broken only by the soft clink of a coffee spoon somewhere near the back. Rick still hadn't moved. He stood behind the counter with the clipboard frozen in his hand, like a man caught in a dream he couldn't wake from. Melissa and Dylan hovered nearby, their expressions twisted in disbelief. And Grace stood tall, composed and waiting. Charles turned to Rick, his voice calm but edged with finality. "Rick," he said, "your employment here is officially terminated. As of this moment, you no longer work for Meadowbrook Diner." The words struck the room like a lightning bolt. Rick opened his mouth, stammered, "You can't be serious," and then fell silent again under Charles's gaze. "I trusted you to run this place in my absence." Charles continued, "And what I found was a culture of neglect, exclusion, and outright disrespect. His tone never rose, but the weight of his words filled the space. You looked the other way while your staff judged customers by the dirt on their boots or the clothes on their backs. You punished the one person who still understood what this place was built on: kindness, fairness, and hard work. Charles took a slow breath, then added, "Your leadership ends here." He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he turned to Grace and extended his hand, not just in gesture, but in trust. "This is Grace," he announced to the room. "You all know her. You've worked beside her. Some of you tried to silence her, but she spoke up anyway. She chose decency when others chose convenience. And that's why she is now your new manager." Murmurs rippled across the dining floor. A few younger servers exchanged glances, stunned. One of the dishwashers peeked out from the kitchen with wide eyes. Grace looked around at all of them, her heart pounding but her posture unshaken. She wasn't here to seek revenge. She was here to rebuild. Charles turned back to the rest of the staff, locking eyes with each of them. "I came here pretending to be just another customer," he said. "What I saw disgusted me. Certain guests were ignored, others were treated with open contempt. Not because they were rude or disrespectful, but because they didn't look like they'd leave a big tip. I was one of them. You judged me on sight." He paused and let the weight of that truth hang in the air. No one dared to speak. Melissa crossed her arms, trying to mask her embarrassment. Dylan stared at the floor. Rick had already begun backing toward the door, the clipboard now limp in his hand. "This ends today," Charles declared. "We're not going to run this place based on who we think deserves respect. Everyone deserves respect. The customers, the staff, and that includes those of you who were overlooked, unheard, or made to feel small just for doing the right thing." His gaze shifted once more to Grace. "This woman reminded me of why I started Meadowbrook Diner in the first place. She reminded me that it's not about profits or polish. It's about people, and starting now, she has full authority to bring this place back to what it was meant to be." As Charles stepped back, Grace felt every eye in the room shift toward her. There was no applause, no welcome committee, just quiet recognition, and beneath that the uneasy tremor of change. She didn't need celebration. What she needed was the chance to lead. She stepped forward, nodded once at Charles, and then turned to face the team. "Things are going to be different around here," she said, her voice steady. "If you're here to work hard, treat people right, and help this place grow, I'll have your back. But if you're here to look down on people or coast through shifts while others pick up your slack, those days are over." And with that, a new chapter began, not with thunder or applause, but with quiet resolve and the promise of something better. In the days that followed Charles's announcement, the mood inside Meadowbrook Diner shifted, but not in a way that brought instant clarity or peace. Change rarely does. Instead, the air thickened with tension, subtle glances and long silences that spoke louder than words. Melissa, who had once ruled the dining floor with eye rolls and whispered judgments, now moved through each shift with tight-lipped coldness. She followed instructions, but with a mechanical precision that stripped any sincerity from her service. Her greetings were monotone, her movements stiff. She wasn't outwardly rebellious, but the message in her silence was clear. She wasn't happy, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Dylan, on the other hand, didn't bother masking his disdain. He dragged through his shifts with a scowl, slamming plates a little too hard on tables, muttering under his breath about how things used to be better when people minded their business. He spent more time sulking in the back hallway than helping with side work, and whenever Grace passed by, he'd stop talking just long enough to make her presence feel unwelcome. Other staff members, unsure where to align themselves, watched everything, like spectators at a silent war. A few began testing boundaries, wondering if the new boss had teeth or if this was just another short-lived shuffle in leadership. But Grace didn't bite. She didn't raise her voice or storm through the diner demanding loyalty. Instead, she did what she had always done best. She observed. She took mental notes of who showed up early without being asked, who quietly stepped in when someone else slacked off, who rolled their eyes when a customer walked in wearing construction boots. She spent her mornings on the floor, her afternoons in the back office, catching up on policies, payroll, and performance reviews that had been ignored for too long. She greeted every employee by name. She praised good work in real time, and when someone crossed a line, she pulled them aside, not to humiliate them, but to ask one simple question: is this really who you want to be here? The staff who had thrived under Rick's favoritism struggled the most. They were used to a system where charm mattered more than work ethic, where playing favorites meant job security. One server who had coasted for over a year doing the bare minimum quit the first time Grace asked her to restock condiments during a lull. Another, a line cook who had grown comfortable ignoring special requests, stormed out mid-shift after Grace implemented a new customer feedback system. But not everyone resisted. Some hesitated, tested her, and slowly came around. A dishwasher, who had never once spoken to her, started offering to refill coffee carafes. A shy hostess began stepping up to train new hires, her confidence blooming in the quiet space Grace created for growth. It wasn't easy. Grace went home exhausted more nights than not, her mind spinning with what still needed fixing, but she refused to let bitterness grow roots. Every time Melissa snapped at a coworker or Dylan sighed dramatically during pre-shift meetings, Grace reminded herself they were symptoms of a deeper sickness, one that wouldn't heal overnight. Reform wasn't about flipping a switch. It was about showing up day after day with patience and purpose. Grace held to that belief like a compass. She knew that rebuilding Meadowbrook wasn't about proving herself to the old guard. It was about creating a space where decency, not dominance, defined the culture. And slowly, it began to work. Customers noticed the change first. They lingered longer, tipped more generously, left kind notes on receipts that said things like, "This place feels different now." Some even asked if the diner was under new ownership. Grace always smiled and said, "No, just new leadership." Among the staff, there were still difficult days. Melissa still rarely smiled. Dylan still dragged his feet, but even they couldn't deny that something was shifting. The diner felt cleaner, lighter, more alive, and Grace, in her quiet resilience, became the heartbeat of that transformation, not with force, but with unwavering consistency. She didn't just want to lead Meadowbrook, she wanted to heal it, and little by little she was doing exactly that. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It came slowly, quietly, like sunlight filtering into a room that had been dark for too long under Grace's leadership. Meadowbrook Diner began to change, not just in structure or routine, but in spirit. The shift wasn't marked by grand announcements or sweeping gestures, but by the subtle power of consistency. Grace showed up every morning before the doors opened, checked inventory, wiped down counters, and greeted the earliest arriving staff with warmth. She didn't lead with intimidation or pride. She led with presence, with patience, with a steady reminder that everyone, regardless of their title, deserved to be treated with dignity. The staff began to respond, not all at once, and not without setbacks, but day by day, something softened. Melissa, once icy and withdrawn, stopped scoffing during meetings and started actually listening. She never apologized, but one afternoon she quietly stepped in to help a new hire who was overwhelmed during the lunch rush. Dylan still moved slower than most, but he no longer rolled his eyes when Grace asked for help. And when a customer spilled their coffee one morning, he rushed over with napkins before anyone else could. The new hires, fresh-faced and unsure, found something rare in Meadowbrook, a workplace that didn't just demand performance, but offered support. Grace's influence wasn't just felt by the team, it extended to the customers too. Regulars returned more frequently, often commenting on how something feels different now. First-timers left with smiles and notes of thanks. One even mailed a handwritten letter praising the environment and saying it reminded them of diners from decades ago when kindness was the norm, not the exception. The online reviews began to shift as well, replacing past complaints with stories of unexpected hospitality and warmth. Grace read every one of them, printing out her favorites and taping them to the staff bulletin board with small handwritten notes of appreciation. She never sought recognition. In fact, she often deflected praise, redirecting it to the team. It's not just me, she'd say, it's all of us choosing to care a little more. But the truth was, it was her steady heart at the center of everything. Grace had created a space where people were no longer afraid to speak up, where kindness wasn't mocked but modeled, where hard work didn't go unnoticed. She implemented fair scheduling, allowed anonymous feedback, and created an open-door policy that actually meant something. And in doing so, she earned something she had once thought was out of reach: respect. Not the kind you demand, but the kind you inspire. Looking back, the staff began to realize they were part of something rare. Meadowbrook Diner wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The place that had once been cold and transactional had become a haven for second chances, small wins and daily growth. Grace's story, once quiet and almost forgotten, was now being talked about in whispers of admiration. Some even called it a redemption arc. But to her, it was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to herself and to everyone watching silently from the sidelines that courage and character could still shape a workplace from the inside out. And so, Meadowbrook Diner entered a new era, one not defined by fear, favoritism, or hierarchy, but by heart, a place where people mattered, a place where service meant more than speed, a place where one woman's quiet defiance became the foundation for lasting change. Grace stood at the center of it all, not just as a manager, but as a living reminder that integrity once planted can bloom in even the most unlikely of places. If this story moved, you take a moment to reflect on the power of one voice. Grace didn't have authority at first, but she had courage, and that changed everything. At Deep Inside HQ, we believe stories like these deserve to be told, remembered, and shared. So if you believe in integrity, in fairness, in the quiet strength of doing the right thing, help us spread the message. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been in Grace's shoes? Your story could inspire someone else. We're building a community of heart resilience and truth, and we'd be honored to have you with us.